Masechta Challah, Perek Daled, Mishnah Aleph. Shtei nashim she'asur shnei kabin v'nogu zeh b'zeh, afilu hein mimin echad p'turim. Two portions of dough, each of which is too small to be subject to the chiv of challah, but together are big enough to be mechuyev and challah. In certain cases, they could be combined into a single chiv of challah. In Perek Beis, the Tana mentioned the machlekes regarding how they must be attached for them to combine. They must be noishech, according to the Chacham, meaning that they must stick to each other so firmly that some of the dough would remain attached to the other if they were to be pulled apart. According to Belezer, if the two doughs were placed touching each other in the basket, they do combine. So again, shtei nashim she'asu shnei kabin, if two women made two doughs of one kav each dough did not contain the minimum amount of flour that's mechuyev and challah. This Mishnah, which discusses a case where the doughs together contain two kav and a challah, is following the shita in the Mishnah Eidis that a dough is not mechuyev and challah unless it was made with a minimum of 2 kabin of flour. The halacha, however, follows the shita that there is a chiyuv of challah as long as the dough is made with 1 1/4 kabin of flour. Chameshas Rav Kamach, as we mentioned many times throughout this Masechta. Although the Mishnah discusses women, the halachas of this Mishnah apply equally to men as well. Women are mentioned because they bear the main responsibility of fulfilling the mitzvah of challah, we stated in the Mishnah in Shabbos, and it has to do with the fact that it's a tikkun for the chet of Adam Harishon, which we'll talk about a different time in Mitzvah Shem. So afilu hein mimin echad p'turim. So shtei nashim shashu shnei kabin v'nogu zeh b'zeh, and the two doughs touch each other, forming a combined dough large enough to be subject to challah. According to Rebbe Lezer, the doughs touched while in the same basket. According to the Chachamim, they stuck to each other so firmly that some of one dough would remain attached to the other if they were to be pulled apart. Afilu hein mimin echad p'turim, the halacha is that even if the two doughs were made from the same kind of flour, they're parted from the chiyuv of challah. This is because the combined doughs of different people are not going to be viewed as one single dough. Since each woman is careful to keep her portions separate, each dough is considered on its own. In fact, even if the women would knead their portions together in a single large dough, but they plan to bake each portion separately, the doughs of the two women are viewed as being separate. But when the two doughs belong to one woman, the halacha is as follows: min b'minoi chayev v'shaloi b'minoi potter. If one kind of dough is joined with its own kind of dough, for example, if both doughs are made of wheat flour, the combined dough is mechuyev and challah. Typically, a woman doesn't mind if her own doughs touches each other or join together. Therefore, when they join together, they're considered one large dough as long as they're made from the same type of flour. V'shaloi b'minoi potter. However, if one kind of dough is joined with another kind of dough, for example, wheat dough with barley dough, the combined dough is pater from the chiyuv of challah. Normally, when a woman makes two doughs from different types of flour, she is careful to keep them separate. Nevertheless, if a single dough is needed from a mixture of different kinds of flour, the varieties do combine, meaning the two minim do combine to establish a chiyuv of challah, as was mentioned in Perek Aleph, Mishnah Aleph. Mishnah Beis. Ezehu min b'minoi. The previous Mishnah taught us that two small portions of dough that are touching combine into a single chiyuv of challah if the two portions are made from the same type of flour. There are 5 types of grain that are mechuyev and challah, as we just mentioned from Perek Aleph Mishnah Aleph: wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. This Mishnah discusses which of these types of grain are considered the same kind and combine with one another to become a single challah-liable dough. Ezehu min b'minoi. Which grains are similar enough to be viewed as a kind of grain combined with its own kind, with regard to combining into a single challah. Hachitin einan metzarfen makoil ela makusman. Wheat does not combine with any grain other than spelt. Wheat is not similar to barley, rye, or oats. Thus, it does not combine with those grains, but wheat is similar to spelt, and those two grains will thus combine. Thus, a wheat dough and a spelt dough combine to form a single large dough that's mechuyev and challah. However, a wheat dough and a dough made from any of the other 3 minim are viewed as separate, and both are going to be pater from challah. This, however, applies only to separate doughs that were joined, as was taught in Perek Aleph Mishnah Aleph. When flour or 2 of more of the 5 chameshas haminim are kneaded together, they combine into a single large challah dough, which would be mechuyev and challah, regardless of whether the types of flour are similar or not. Ha'se'orim mitzdarfos ha'makol chutz min hachitim. Barley, on the other hand, combines with every grain except for wheat. Barley is similar to spelt, rye, and oats, but not similar to wheat. Thus, barley combines with spelt, rye, and oats, but not with wheat. Spelt is unique, that it shares a characteristic with both wheat and barley. Therefore, it combines with either one. Rye and oats, however, share characteristics only with barley, not with wheat. This is very interesting because the Gemara Pesachim on Avlamed Hey mentions that Chitim and Kusmin is one team, so to speak. Sa'irem, rye, and oats is another team. This would seemingly be mashma not like that Gemara, but it's can say that it's machlekes, can say it's two shitas. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, Sha'ar haminim etzarfen zemzeh. The other kinds of grain, besides wheat and barley, namely spelt, oats, and rye, all combine with one another. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is not arguing on the Tanna Kama. Rather, he's providing information about spelt, rye, and oats that were not taught by the Tanna Kama. The Tanna Kama was mefarish the status of wheat and barley, but not the status of spelt, rye, and oats. Nonetheless, we already know that according to the Tanna Kama, spelt combined with either wheat or barley, while rye and oats combined with barley but not with wheat. We do not know, however, whether these three grains combine with one another. Accordingly, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri now explains that the Tanna Kama maintains that these three grains do combine with one another. B'kitzer, what do we have? So we have 3 points here. Wheat combines only with spelt. The second nakuda is spelt combines with everything. The third nakuda is barley, rye, and oats combine with each other and with spelt, but not with wheat. Okay, that's that. Mishnah Gimel. Shnei kabin v'kaveres a kavtruma be'emtza inan mitzarfis. Having discussed how two attached doughs can combine into a single chiv of challah, the Mishnah discusses when doughs are not directly attached to each other that can combine. Shnei kabin, if someone made two doughs of one kav each, v'kav is a kav truma be'emtza, and a dough made from a kav of rice flour or from a kav of truma, which is not mechuyev and challah, is between the two doughs connecting them. In this case, chulin flour of any of the 5 types of grain that are mechuyev in the chiyuv of challah were used to make two doughs containing only one kav of flour each. A third dough made from rice or truma flour, which is both patur from challah, was then attached to the sides of the wheat doughs. The dough stuck so firmly that some of one dough would remain attached to the other if they were to be pulled apart. Einan mitzdarfas, the two doughs do not combine into a single chiyuv of challah because they're not connected with dough that's mechuyev in challah. Challah, if you have dough that's patur from challah, it cannot serve as a bridge to combine the two small wheat doughs into a single chiyuv of challah. So even a rice dough or truma dough made with 2 kavin of flour, which is much bigger than the ones on the side, will not combine in the smaller doughs together with it, since it itself is patur from the chiyuv of challah, regardless of its size. However, if something, meaning if you have a dough that was already mechuyev and challah, whose challah was already separated, and that's between the two doughs are mitzdarf in the chiyuv of challah, shekvar neschayev v'challah. The reason for this is because the connecting dough is already mechuyev and challah. Unlike a dough of rice flour or truma, a dough which challah has been separated was mechuyev. A dough which challah has been separated already at one point was mechuyev and challah. Therefore, it can serve to combine the two other doughs into one chiyuv of challah. Any dough that could be mechuyev and challah can cause the other doughs to be mitzdaref for a chiyuv of challah. In fact, this is true even if the connecting dough is made from sa'urim and the other doughs are made from wheat, which normally do not combine, as we just mentioned in the previous Mishnah. Nevertheless, since the dough is made from a grain that's mechuyev and challah, meaning it could be that in a certain oifen it's not mitzdaref, but mitzad itself it's mechuyev. So if you have two things of sa'urim, it's zecher mechuyev, and no one's going to say that it's patur, right? The Mishnah, Parakal Mishnah Aleph said that these chamesh haminim, they are mechuyev and challah. Nevertheless, since the dough is made from a grain that's mechuyev in challah, it can serve as a bridge to connect the two doughs into a single chiyuv. Mishnah Daled. Kav chodosh v'kav yashon shenoshchu zeh b'zeh. Dough made with flour of 1 year's grain cannot be designated as challah for dough made with flour from another year's grain. For the purposes of challah, grain belongs to the year in which its kernels were formed. Thus, flour made from kernels of grain that formed in the current year is known as the new flour, the chodosh, while the flour made from kernels formed in the previous year is known as old flour, yashon. So the Mishnah discusses a case where dough made from the flour of 1 year's grain was joined together with dough made with flour of another year's grain. So kav chodesh v'kav yashon shenoshchu zeh b'zeh. If a dough made of a kav of new flour and a dough made of a kav of old flour, which was from last year's grain, were firmly attached, so that they were neshech each other, they bite into one another. So Rabbi Shmuel Leimer yidol min ha'emtza. Rabbi Shmuel says that one separates challah from the middle point, the point where the two doughs are joined. So he's separating the challah from both doughs. The Yerushalmi explains that Rabbi Shmuel learns that this halacha, that dough from 2 different years combine through a type of kal v'chomer. The Chachamim also doing this. The Chachamim agree that according to the Torah, Chadash and Yashan combine, Meaning, Minat Torah, there's no reason why Chadash and Yashon shouldn't combine to be Mechuyev and Chala. Nevertheless, they were concerned that if people would separate Chala in the way presented by Rabbi Shmuel, they might mistakenly conclude that Trumas and Maishos too may be separated from new produce from old produce, or old produce from new produce. So we know that that's not allowed. We know that that's also. So the only solution in this case is that Chala be taken from the two other obligated doughs, from a new dough for the kav of new dough, and from an old dough for the kav of old dough in the mixture. Hanoidel Chala min kav, regarding someone who separated challah from a dough made with only a kav of flour and later added enough dough to make it large enough to be mechuyev and challah. Rabbi Kiva says challah. What he separated is considered challah retroactively. Rabbi Kiva agrees with the other Tanoim who hold that dough made from a kav of flour is not mechuyev and challah, as we see from his psak in Perek Beis Mishnah Gimel. Nevertheless, he holds that once the dough is large enough to become mechuyev in the chiyuv of challah, it's viewed as having been mechuyev originally as well, from the time the first kav was needed. Thus, the challah that was originally separated is going to be good. So if you're meisif onto the dough, so then it's lemafreya, it can turn into good challah. Right? That's what the Rab says. V'ushehishlam ala isa acher ken kishir challah. The kem shenishlam hashir ave challah lemafreya. But the Chachamim say, it's not challah, since it was separated before the dough was mechuyev in challah. Since at the time the challah was separated, the dough did not contain enough flour to be subject to the challah obligation, the Chachamim hold that the separation is not good, and it was never considered challah to begin with. Okay, now we have Mishnah Hay, which is going to be a continuation of the Shmuez between Rabbi Kiva and the Chachamim that we just discussed in Mishnah Daled. Shnei kabin. If someone made two doughs of one kav each, shenitlo chalosoi shel zeh b'fnei atzmai v'shel zeh b'fnei atzmai, and the challah of this dough was separated by itself, and the challah of the other dough was separated by itself. Chazav ha'osad yisachas. Now he went and combined the two doughs into a single two kav dough. So Rabbi Kiva paters the combined dough from a chiyuv of challah because challah was already separated. The halacha is, with what Rabbi Kiva said, this is Rabbi Kiva L'shitasa from the previous Mishnah, where he paskins that if challah was separated from a dough containing less than the minimum shear of flour, it's good as long as the final size of the dough was large enough to be mechuyev and challah. But the Chacham required that the challah be separated. According to the Chachamim, the original chiyuv of being mafresh challah was no good, since each dough contained less than the smallest shear for challah. Since the combined dough does contain the minimum amount of flour, it's necessary to separate challah from the combined dough. So Zak the Mishnah nimtza chumroi kuloi, the chumra Rebbe Kiva that he said earlier in Mishnah Daled, when he takes off a challah from a kav, that even if it's less than the shear of challah, it's going to become challah. So it emerges there Rebbe Kiva's chumra in the previous Mishnah, where he paskins that challah that's initially separated has the kedusha of challah, leads to a kula in this Mishnah where he paters the combined dough from challah. Rebbe Kiva's kula in this Mishnah regarding the combined dough is based on the chumrah in the previous Mishnah regarding the original challah separation. Since the initial challah separation is good, there's no need to separate challah again after the doughs are combined. On the other hand, the Chachamim's leniency regarding the original challah separation leads to their stringent ruling regarding the combined dough. Since the initial challah separation never took effect, the doughs become mechuyev to the challah chiyuv now when they are combined. Mishnah Vav. Noetel Adam kedei challah me'isa shluhoma chalasa l'asisa betara liyos mafresh alav v'hoylech chalas demai ad shetisrach. This is a very difficult Mishnah, and I want to try to discuss it a little more to try to understand what we're talking about. The Mishnah discusses a situation where there's a suffix where the challah had been separated from the dough. The Mishnah refers to such dough as the challah of the mai. Normally, challah may be separated either from the dough itself or from other dough that's mechuyev in challah. The shmuz pertains to designating a dough from which challah has not been separated as challah for dough of the mai that is tamei. So the question's like this: what are we talking about here? Because it's very fair to talk about challah as the mai. The mai has to do with meiser, because Amei Ha'aretz don't, even though we say that Amei Ha'aretz don't take off Meiser, we do say that Reiv Amei Ha'aretz Ma'as from him. They do take off Meiser. Now, Challah has the dinam of Truma. So if Challah has the dinam of Truma is Tevel, this is a Chiv Misa, B'dei Shemaim. Challah also has the same din of Misa B'dei Shemaim. This is in Perek Aleph. So technically speaking, it's very difficult to come up with a case of what chalas d'mai is, unless we're talking about that you just have a suffix if challah is taken from this at all or not. Normally, the term d'mai is used in the context of maisus, in reference to produce purchased from Am Haaretz. The Chacham were geyser that the purchaser must take off maiser from such produce, since there was a significant miut of Am Haaretz who neglected to take maiser of their produce. Here, however, we're not discussing dough that was made from produce purchased from an Am Haaretz, since there's no requirement for the Am Haaretz to separate challah from such produce, because the chiv of challah doesn't take effect until it's needed. Even if dough or bread itself was purchased from Am Haaretz, we may in fact trust that Am Haaretz challah was separated, since we don't find that Am Haaretz were lax about separating challah. Rather, the chalas d'mai or the isas d'mai that we're referring to in this Mishnah is a dough whose status is a suffix for some reason, such as if there were contradictory testimonies whether challah was separated from it. The term d'mai is used in a borrowed sense to describe dough whose chiyuv for challah is a suffix. The Mefarshim offer various explanations to this Mishnah. Each explanation has its own difficulties, so we're going to go with what the Rambam says in Hilchos Bikurim, Perek Zayin Halacha Yud Gimel. The Rav, however, explains the Mishnah as referring to actual produce of an Am Haaretz. Now, it's not that difficult to say that we're talking about Chalas Am Haaretz the same way we would refer to the Meiser, because there's seemingly a Mishnah in Perek Hey in D'mai that refers to Chalas D'mai as a fruit, a Paris or a dough that Am Haaretz would not take challah from. So it's not completely wrong to say, Mishnah is not completely wrong. We even have a Mishnah to back us up that there is such a thing as Chalas D'mai. Taisus Yantif, the Melech Shloima, the Mishnah Rishayna, they all get very busy with trying to figure out what exactly is going on over here. So I want to go through the Mishnah as we've been going through now, and then I want to read through the Rash, the basic Rishaynim that goes through a couple of points of how to understand the Mishnah. So, a person may separate an amount that can be used as challah from a tahor dough whose challah has not yet been separated. A person expects to be kneading a number of doughs of demai that are tameh. Instead of separating challah from each of those doughs, which will be tameh, may not be eaten, he may set aside a large piece of non-demai dough, that's tahor, from which he will designate small portions as challah for the doughs of demai that are tameh. The piece of tahor dough must come from a dough that's still mechuyev in challah, since the chiyuv of challah cannot be designated, since dough that's pater from challah cannot be designated as challah, so the owner has to separate a large piece of dough that's still mechuyev in challah, and then designates part of that piece as challah for the dough from which it was separated. The rest of the piece, which remains mechuyev in challah, must be designated as challah for the other doughs. So la'asoisa betara, he has to make sure he keeps it in a state of tara, in order to continually designate portions of it as a challah for doughs of demai that are tameh. The Mishnah will soon explain why this is mutter, even though it's ordinarily forbidden to designate dough that's tahor as challah for dough that is tameh, ad shetisrach. He may continue designating challah from the dough he has separated until it became spoiled, to the point that it's no longer fit for human consumption. At that point, it's not considered food and can no longer be designated as challah. Ordinarily, the portion one wishes to separate as truma or challah must be in close proximity and needs to be min amukaf, in order to the produce that it comes to permit. In addition, the chacham or geyser, the one may not designate produce that's tahor as truma or challah on something that's tameh, and the Mishnah will explain why these halachas will not apply over here. Shechalas d'mai teles min haTorah ala tameh v'shalem min hamukav. It's mutter here to designate tahor dough as challah for tameh dough, and to designate a dough that's not close by as challah, because challah for d'mai may be taken from tahor dough for tameh dough and from a dough that is not been close by. The regular restrictions on designating tahor dough as challah for tameh dough and on designating a dough that's not close by as challah do not apply to demai. So, are we talking about real demai, or we're just talking about a borrowed term? So let's do the Rash. The Rash looked as way. Shechalas demai nitelis b'torah al tameh shlemin amukulayim. K'moshe kila b'hanoch kulas kachei kila b'lutrim in arala yofa. The same way they were mekel with the kulas by demai, so too they were mekel over here that you're allowed to take off min hara from the good onto bad. V'teima. The question is, mahi chalas demai. What exactly is chalas demai? Ibelei keach isa olechem ha'am haaretz. If we're talking about where somebody bought dough or bread from ha'am haaretz, the mafresh challah, that he has to take off challah mishum deshem lehafrisha ha'am haaretz, because maybe ha'am haaretz never took off challah. Or where do we find that we suspect Amei Oretz for not taking of Challah? We know that there's no suspicion that they don't take off Truma Gedaila. Why should Challah be any different than that? The reason why we suspect them that they don't take off a Meiser from their parents, because they hold that because there's no Chiyuv Misa, they don't have to do that. Mishum Trumas Meiser de Isba, because of the Trumas Meiser that's in there. So Kol's Mamshla Karl of Shem Meiser, they hold that if they're not Kairish Shem for Meiser, so then you don't have to worry about the Trumas Meiser that's in the Meiser that they have to take off to give to the Kain. Yesh Lefarish. So we have to explain the Chalas D'mai Hainu Chalas Shehuma Metvur Shel D'mai Shalokach Tvur Me'amoratz. Chalas D'mai is Chala that he separated from Tvua, from grain that he bought, that he bought Tvua from Amoratz, and he ground it up and he baked it, and now he has a chiv of Chala from these pairs of D'mai. The Hirvish Mimena Chala, and then he separates Chala from them. Oisa Chala Asur B'Achila Aflakain Achi Afish Mimena Meiser Utrumas Meiser Kedin D'mai. So this Chala that he, or this dough better, that he baked from the Tvua that he bought from an Amoretz is Asur to eat it, is Asur B'Achila even to a Kayin until he's Mafresh Meiser and Trumas Meiser, like the halacha is of D'mai. Even though we have a mission in the first Parak Aleph Mishnah Gimel of D'mai that talks about Chalas Amoretz v'Hameduma P'tur Min D'mai. We have a case of Chalas Amoretz and Meduma which are potter from D'mai. So is that what we're talking about here? That's something else. Zok Rash Hani Mili b'She Amoretz Mafrisha Kahida Seif Hanazakan She'osin LeBetara. The case that we're talking about over here is an where the Amoretz was mafresh. We did separate the truma, meiser. I mean, Kahida Seif Hanazakan, like we find that the Gemara says at the end of Hanazakan She'osin LeBetara, where the Amoretz separated it betara. But a regular Yisrael that bought tvua from the marketplace, a bola hafresh, and he's time to be mafresh trumas hamaisus, tzarich l'sakin gamas achalim and hamaisus. He also needs to make sure that when he takes off meiser, he also has to take off chala. Ravaishia mechalik came. The parakam is ma'ik the prisha sham. Ravaishia is mechalik like this in the first parak of Mai, like we explained over there. Rabbi Yechanan Palagasa. Rabbi Yechanan argues over there. V'omar he hada. It's the same thing that you don't have to. And in Parak Hev Demai we talk about Chalas Amaoret. We're referring to a case where the Amaoret did the Chala Betara, came to the Tarach Lasas Betara, came taking Chalos like the Prisha Sham. So in Parak Hey in Demai when it refers to Chalas Amaoret, so we're talking about where he took off Chala, he was mafresh Chala, and he did a betara, because Chala we know, we spoke many times already in this Masechta, that the Chala has to be done betara. You have to be careful that it shouldn't become tamei. They came in the Tarach Lasas betara, came taking Chalos like the Prisha Sham, like the Gemara explained of the Hilkach b'shar duchti mechayev Chalas D'mai b'maisus. So we see that we have a chiyuv of D'mai, a chiyuv of Chala, meaning that you have a Chalas D'mai that's mechuyev in maisus. So really, the D'mai is going back to Maisus. It's not necessarily Chalas D'mai that there's a suffix of Chala in the D'mai is a suffix of Chala. The suffix of the suffix that we're talking about over here is Taka, a suffix of Maisus. Now, of us we made a dough from Paris that were bought from an Amoretz, and you need to take off D'mai. Hilkach b'shar duchti mechai v'chalas D'mai b'maisus. V'hashta ba'oised tikun shemafresh l'maisus trumas maiser. Kigoinchi nichlius mafresh l'chalas shaloi hilchol mafresh asher tisrach. Now back to our Mishnah, we're talking about over here like this. So he bought these pairs he bought the tvua from Amoretz. So he's mafresh l'maiser and trumas maiser, and he also has to take off chala. So mafresh l'chalas shaloi, he takes off his chalas, and he has to keep on taking off every time he makes dough from this tvua until it spoils. In this case, the chachamim were makel to take off truma from rala yaf, which normally you can't do. Even though by regular d'mai the din is like regular truma, but over here we're being more makel. Kedemuchach v'perkam dechul davavam in the base Gabir Meir the Ochel Allah Shel Yerek the Mukila Rabbeinu Tam B'Dmai. What was the case that Rameir ate a Yerek? How was he able to do that without taking off Meiser? So the Rabbeinu Tam in Taisus in the Chulun understands if they were talking about the Mai. We don't suspect a chaver, a person who's trusted on the Mai, to take off Meiser Mai. So it's just a technical difficulty how he's able to be mafresh challah before he takes off Mai. Zimnin de Misrami hocha kahi. So the case would be that we know there's a tzir in the Mishnayos that comes from Perek Gimel Mishnah Aleph in Demai, the Machilim Esanim Demai Vesachsani Demai, and the Gemara says that a person can be mafker olos in the chasim to be able to be zeicha in this case of eating Demai. The kohen that eats the challah zokuk la'aser. If the kohen is an ashir, then he has to take off meiser because he's eating from the mai. I mean, he's not an oni; he was never mafkes nechasim, so then he has to take off the mai. So that's the case that we're talking about over here. That's just how the Rash understands it, and the Rash goes weiter. But I want to stop here, and we'll continue. Mitzvah the next year we'll continue with from Perek Zayin to the end of the Masechta. Sei gesund.